talking to you from right now?
Right now, I'm in London.
Okay. Is that where you rode out the lockdowns when the pandemic hit?
No, I've been living in Miami. Actually, I've been in Miami for 4 years now. And then when the lockdowns hit, Miami was probably one of the better places to be, in all honesty, especially, being anywhere near the water. I have a lot of friends of mine that were in New York and in other places that were locked in apartment buildings. It was a lot more difficult to kind of get out. And that would be you. So you know exactly what that's like. Fortunately for me, I live right by the water, so I was actually able to have a bit of fresh air. But there was, the period of time when everybody was like locked inside their doors and spraying Lysol on all the delivered foods you got,
Yeah, it was weird, man. Yeah, very, very strange. And then are you back out across the pond now just because you're getting back to touring a bit?
Doing a summer tour this year. I definitely feel that during pandemic, I was able to start kind of restructuring a lot of the way my business is set up and focusing a bit more on my art side, focusing a bit more on the production music side, doing other things as well as gearing up for when the world eventually would open up. But also really enjoying a lot more personal time. And I've been kind of what I call on the hamster wheel for quite some long time of just, never coming off tour, as it were, for very much time. So
I mean, what, like 30 years, right? Something like that?
Pretty much a 30-year grind in terms of like getting on tour and really kind of going for it. For me, the best part of being on tour is connecting with audiences, but one of the most difficult parts of touring is just the lack of grounding you have in your own home, in your own space. So I really enjoyed, funny enough, being at home, although, it sucks not to be able to work and be able to kind of take care of everything you need to take care of. But because of that, it's allowed me the ability to restructure how I'm organizing other things in my life that can bring in revenue, but more importantly, also giving me more time to focus on a few other things that I really enjoy and really appreciating the touring time when I do.
Sure, of course. I mean, before the pandemic hit, were you kind of just on that hamster wheel, like you were saying? Were you feeling like it was time for a change, but you just didn't have the time? Or was this sort of just a hard reset period?
I think it's a combination of everything. I was definitely looking at it as trying to begin to structure time in for more songwriting, a bit more personal time. But because of the way things were kind of rolling along, it was more like planning for the following year and trying to move the pieces in order to align things comfortably. And then basically the pandemic came along and it was a hard reset for everything and everyone.
Right.
But at the same time, what that did is sometimes circumstances force you to make a change that in the end becomes a positive change. Now, that's not to take away from all the difficulty and the horrible nature of what the pandemic was. But on the other side, I'm very much a believer in looking for the positive in every situation or the lesson in it. So for me, I try to draw what I could turn from a negative into a positive.
Sure, of course. Which is, I think the best any of us can do in that kind of situation. It's just interesting for me to think about someone with a career like yours where you really, before that, I mean, we had just said, 30 something years on the road. Were there any breaks in there at any point? I mean, was this really the first big break?
I mean, in terms of, I've taken some breaks, birth of my child, obviously, but it was never as prolonged. It was definitely not a year and a half.
Yeah.
I've never had like 6 months off where I'm just like, I'm not touring, I'm not going anywhere. I haven't done that for basically about 30 years. I haven't had an extended period of time where I'm home and I'm like, okay, So this is what normal life is like.
Well, yeah, because it's easy when you're always, flying off somewhere, right? To kind of live in this, your own bubble. Like I always tell people that if you can describe it, but if you haven't lived that kind of lifestyle, it's hard to really understand that when you come home, you almost feel like an alien, right? It's hard to relate to kind of the quote unquote normal lifestyle.
My description of it is there is a time stream, which is life. Then there's the tour stream, which is the life when you step out of your normal life and you go on tour. Then you're in this kind of parallel reality that touches into other people's lives, but your own life stream is kind of going along and you're not really connecting with it until you come off tour. So it's constantly kind of diving in and out.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly difficult to maintain a semblance of normality within your normal time stream. And what happens is your alternate reality, which is tour life, becomes your reality of life. It carries challenges and it carries benefits as well. There's amazing places I've been able to go to in the world because of touring, and my records have brought me, and I say my records, I mean like the stuff that I was playing from my early days of vinyl. I was like, this record bag has been my kind of passport to travel to different places around the world and see amazing things. But at the same time, it's difficult when you're in the really intense cycle of it to reconnect and pull out of it unless you have a very, very well structured team that listens to you. And what you find is a lot of artists, it's almost like the artists wind up working for management.
Oh, yeah.
As opposed to management working for the artists. And we've seen, unfortunately, in the past few years with guys like Avicii and other people, where this has had the kind of ultimate adverse effect. And it's one of the things that I'm very conscious of, and I really do try to, discuss with friends and peers and people that are coming up. It's like you have to maintain your grounding and your root of yourself without allowing anyone else to take that away from you, or you allow that to be taken away from you, because that's really what happens.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point because, and I think too, especially if you're an artist who's been working for years and years and struggling, just to try to make something happen, when it finally starts happening, then it gets so hard to say no to anything, right?
100%.
And then all of a sudden,
when there are people who are relying on you, you wind up building up a team. You've got managers, agents, social media team, PR people, tour managers. There's usually an entire kind of ancillary business that circulates around the business of being an artist. And there are other people that basically inevitably make their living off of what you do. So it's kind of hard if you don't have very clear boundaries to prevent that from taking over and then dictating the pace.
Of course.
Especially when you have a measure of success.
Well, what was it like for you early on? Because, obviously now you've had many years to kind of perfect this machine that we're talking about. But for you, and we'll kind of bounce around a little bit, but I'm curious, when you first started touring really heavily, were you ready for it? What kind of memories do you have of those first couple of years when you really started to catch a spark?
My first tour to the UK was 1990, I believe. And that kind of puts a date on me. But that very first tour, funny enough, was my very first tour with Todd Terry, who really kind of sat me down during the tour and gave me his perspective, having been on tours and having kind of been in the cycle for a minute. And Todd's one of my very good friends, but he's also somebody who I've described as my mentor for that period of time in terms of me coming into the field, just kind of, sitting me down and telling me about certain realities and certain things I should, prepare for, things I should do. And what was interesting was prior to that first international tour, I had done a couple of shows. I played in around New York quite a bit. I think I had maybe played in one or two states, in a couple of states. But that was really like, that was around the time I had my track Love Dancing, which was signed to 10 records in the UK. That was the very first tour that really sparked off my then much more prolonged touring cycle. And that's when I started. I was in the middle of doing a ton of remixes at that point in time, which really then connected with the UK audience. And that started really developing me practically living in the UK for 3, 4, or 5 months at a time, just kind of cycling back and forth. So that period was intense. It was a bit more gradual than, let's say, someone who has a big hit record who went from 0 to 100, who gets thrown in on the deep end. So for me, it was a little bit different. It was a much more of a gradual growth. But when I got stuck into the touring thing, it became a really intense cycle.
And I mean, obviously, when you're younger, of course, you can handle that. It's, it's all right if a lot of things are happening all at once. But it's interesting too, talking about the UK. I mean, you're over there now, and it seems like you've had this connection with the UK kind of your whole career. I found this, again, bouncing around a little bit. I found this article from The Guardian around the year 2000, 2001, right around when you put out the song Another Chance, which became, a huge, huge hit. And we'll talk about that as well. But there was just an interesting quote in there, just this one line they wrote. And they said that you were the most popular American DJ in the UK at the time. They just sort of gave you that title. And, it's interesting to talk about your first UK tour was where it all started. Then 10 years after that, The Guardian is saying, you're the biggest American DJ in the UK. You're out there now. Like, what is that connection, do you think?
Well, I think early on, the UK was really embracing the soulful end of house music that was coming over from the US. And that was very much at the time of the explosion of acid house and the kind of hacienda house music movement. And a lot of the sounds were coming from America. A lot of producers like myself and like Todd, Terry, Masters at Work, David Morales, Frankie Knuckles, we were creating the music that was being played in all the raves in the UK. So it was kind of a very natural progression to connect to the UK audience, because the music that we were making and that I was personally making was really being championed by a lot of UK DJs. My very first track that was released was a track under the moniker Ego Trip called Dream World. And apparently that became a big proto-techno record in the north of England. As some friends of mine told me, they're like, yeah, this record's like big in the techno scene. And I'm like, the last thing I thought.
Yeah, you didn't have any idea, right?
You can call it whatever. It's still house music to me. What I feel is that from that early embracing of my sound, the UK audience has really connected with everything I've done. And I've connected to them by virtue of coming over here, living here pretty much for long periods of time, and really soaking up the UK culture and just kind of getting an understanding of what moves people here. And it's very interesting for me because I also have my sound that really connects in places like Spain, France, Europe, South America. But specifically what I've done within the more soulful end of the spectrum of what I've done musically really connects here in the UK.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I mean, to give some context, of course, I mean, you were born in New York City, right? In Queens?
In Queens.
Yeah. And you were born and living there. I mean, you were around to see the birth of house music, right? I mean, you were there before what we now call house music.
When house first started coming over from Chicago, at that point in time, it was playing disco, then became known as freestyle, hip hop, obviously. That's where I got a lot of my technique from. Various soul records. And, what I would do is take breaks and different elements from funk records and soul records, cut them up back and forth, and then play disco records. and then house, and then at that point in time, even freestyle music was starting to come into its own. When house music first really started making inroads in New York, it was guys like Larry Levan at the Paradise Garage. Frankie Knuckles was playing in town as well. Those were kind of like the early kind of architects who laid the blueprint out for what then became the full house music scene coming out of New York. So I used to go to the Paradise Garage, loft with Mancuso, playing different styles of music that all fed into the mentality of what, house music was, which to me was the second coming of disco. And I really, really connected with that sound. So at a time when a lot of DJs were playing like the more freestyle Latin, what was it called? Latin hip hop, I guess, is freestyle kind of, music. I really gravitated towards house, and I was spending more time in Manhattan, which is where the scene was a lot more developed for that scene, especially with the gay clubs and clubs like Paradise Garage, and just that different energy, that Manhattan energy was very much geared towards that.
How old were you when you first started going out to these clubs and hearing these sounds?
Well, that I believe I was like about 17, 18.
Yeah, that's
perfect.
Really young. That's the perfect time, though, I feel like, to
100%.
Yeah, get involved with this new scene, this new energy. It's really interesting, man. Do you remember, like, what's your musical background before all of that? Was anyone in your family musical? Did you play any instruments growing up? Anything like that?
I grew up playing the drums, and I started off playing clarinet, believe it or not, with a church band.
Oh, wow.
But at 13 years old is when I really started DJing. I had a friend of mine who was a DJ in Queens, who was like playing block parties and stuff like that. And he was about 14 years old, just 1 year older than me. But I really, at that point in time, I was breakdancing. I was kind of really into that scene. But I really admired how he would control the crowd within the parties. And I was like, I kind of want to do that. One day he asked me to take over at a house party that he had. We lived in the same project building. I took over for him. Well, I guess he was talking to some girl. And that's kind of where I got hooked on it. And, I then started, taking the money I was making, working at the grocery store and doing milk runs or paper runs, paper routes, buying vinyl, commandeering my mother's turntable, saving up money to buy another one. And then really starting to play at home, and then for like little block events in the neighborhood until I started playing out with kind of like my teenage friends, like 16, 17 years old. And they were doing, these kind of block party events, renting out town halls. And then they invited me to come and play. And that's where I kind of really started cutting my teeth.
Yeah. And, I always like to try to give people context so we can all be imagining the same thing. Back then, right? That's what there was to do. That was sort of the roadmap, right? It's not like there were, massive festivals where you could look at it and say, oh, I want to do, point and say, I want to do what that guy is doing on this stage. I mean, it was very local, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make, right?
Very much homegrown and very much an organic local scene. Whereas there would be the local kind of DJ heroes who had their mixtapes, and then that would be circulated around the neighborhood. You also had DJs like Red Alert, Timmy Regisford, who were on the radio, who had the dance shows. Red Alert had hip hop shows, and you had, like I said, Tony Humphries, Timmy Regisford, who was at respectively Kiss and BLS. And those are the dance music shows on the Friday nights and the weekends that were really starting to put forward the sound of house music. But in the kind of early years, it was these DJ mix shows, those hip hop shows and Red Alert and all of these different styles of dance music that was coming out of the clubs, which I was too young to go to. And then I started going to like roller skating events, which then turned into the roller rink events, because they were like a teenage, like I think 16 and up or 14 and up. Then they would turn into like little parties from like 9, 10 o'clock at night. First time I got in trouble was when I came home at like 5 o'clock in the morning after one of those ones, and my mom just grounded me. I was like 16 years old. I nearly gave her a heart attack.
Well, what did they think of you getting into this scene? Did they have any context for it? What did they do?
Well, my mother was very much, and God rest her soul, she's passed on a few years now. But at that point in time, she was very heavily into church. So it was
maybe not a
going out
fan.
and dancing to the devil's music, and then became a DJ, and you're playing the devil's music. And it was the funniest thing for me because I'm like, come on, Ma, stop it.
Right.
My father is an engineer, or was an engineer at the time. And what was interesting is then, if you fast forward later on in life, what he was doing more than anything was just observing at that point in time. And as long as I kind of kept up with my grades, it was fine with him, because it was a creative and constructive outlet. And I was always artistic. I was always painting, drawing. I went to school for art and architecture. I went to the School of Art and Design for high school. So it was always a creative outlet for me. And then fast forward to college years when my grades started slipping a bit and I was spending more time DJing. My father was the one who sat me down and told me, hey, listen, I see you spending a lot of time with this DJing stuff, but, don't be an architect because you think it's going to impress me. You need to follow your own heart, your own dreams. And if you love DJing, you never know, you might be the best DJ in the world. Who knows? But do what makes you happiest, because ultimately you're the only one who has to live with it. I've already got my career. You got to figure yours out. And that was a very pivotal moment for me to kind of go, that makes a lot more sense than I ever expected you to tell me, being the kind of authoritarian, study hard.
Yeah, usually it would go the other way, right?
But it was very, very wise, because that's exactly the same thing I tell my kids. It's like, you just got to follow your heart.
Well, and it's interesting that, you were going to school for architecture, and that maybe there's some of that background in your family as well. And you tell me if I'm reaching too hard on this connection, but I wonder if, you were saying you were painting, doing other creative pursuits as well. Like, I think about music kind of the same way, where you get obsessed with it maybe the same way somebody gets obsessed with architecture or with painting, where it's not really about the thing itself, right? Like, it's not about just what a building is or what a song is, but you're kind of seeing what's in between the spaces of it, right? And trying to see like how it connects to you and how it connects other people.
It's a form of expression, and architecture in its purest form really comes down to creating a space for other humans. But the expression of there's so many ways you could make that space be. And so as an architect, part of my goal was always to find the most creative way to frame a space to then create a habitable place for a human. Music and art comes from the same place of creativity, whereas there's a real direct correlation for me between art, architecture, and music in the sense of architectural elements as framed in space is almost the equivalent to musical notes in time, so that the frequency of music and whatever the rhythmic scale is that you're working in determines the genre and the ultimate sound of what it is a producer's making.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is equivalent to when an architect creates a rhythmic spatial interpretation by how far he places construction elements, be they columns, mullions, and in the windows. The rhythm of architectural elements, if you're looking at architects like Zaha Hadid, Tadao Ando, and the way they space their structural elements and then suspend glass or whatever it is between them to create the space, but also to create a beauty of that space. It's very similar to, again, brushstrokes from an artist, creating, using color to delineate whatever it is they're trying to express, but then create something that is the ultimate form of that expression.
Yeah,
this is kind of it's all interrelated.
Yeah, and when you're saying that, what I'm also hearing is, it's the artist trying to connect and show their perspective, what they're seeing to other people, right? Like
exactly, or what they're hearing in their head.
Yeah, and I think that's the same thing for a DJ, right? Is that I don't know if you were like this, but a common thread I find with a lot of DJs is that even before they were DJing, they were sort of curating music for their friends and saying, hey, have you heard this record? You got to listen to this, all that kind of thing, which to me, that's all kind of the same thing. And then you're doing a live set and you're trying to sort of take people on a journey, if we're saying it artistically. Yeah, man, I love hearing you say that, because it really is all the same thing at the end of the day. And I think it comes from a similar place.
It does come from a similar place. And for me, when I'm performing, when I'm playing, I'm always about creating a connection emotionally with my audience. So whatever I'm playing, and the way I tend to play, I'm really layering elements and creating on-the-spot remixes of tracks, is a combination of playing musical, emotive expression to the crowd, but in addition to that, creating an experience that has levels of peaks, valleys, emotionally poignant moments and emotionally accelerated moments. And all of these things happen with different sonic elements that I'm playing. Snare rolls here, I'm looping a bass line there, or whatever, a vocal. It all is about creating a moment and an emotion within that moment. That's what people tend to remember and walk away from. They'll walk away going, I remember that moment. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And it's hard to make those moments. I mean, I think the magic of DJing, when you're really good and when you're really on, you're making it with the crowd, right? I mean,
exactly.
You can't do it without them, which is, that's kind of the secret sauce of it all. And you had said earlier, you mentioned that your DJing style, which for anybody watching this right now, for anybody listening back later, I mean, if you haven't seen Roger Sanchez DJ, just go on YouTube and look up Roger Sanchez live. But I mean, your style it's crazy, man. It's so technical. Like you said, you're layering, you're looping, you're using multiple decks at once all the time. I'm curious, just as a DJ nerd, did you kind of start off that way? Because I know you said you were inspired by the hip hop style of DJing, taking samples and breaks. Were there other people doing it that way at the time? Because certainly now I think you stand out because of the way you mix records. But was it always that way?
Well, interestingly, so first I'm going to do a quick little
please.
Kind of shout.
I asked
if
5.
you also want to catch me on Twitch, you could just check me out, DJ Roger Sanchez on Twitch. I'm doing a lot of my live streams there where people can kind of also see technically what I do while I'm doing it, plus some things, some sets that I'm doing live from different events that I'm doing around Europe this summer. But where I started off was from a hip hop perspective, obviously first 2 turntables, a mixer, and then getting really good at not only cutting back and forth and scratching, but blending was my thing, is these seamless transitions from one track to another. So I really took my time with that. And then that really married well into when I was playing disco and funk and soul previous to house music. And really there was no name for it because there was so many different genres. You could play a rock record that had a dance beat and you were just playing dance music. So the idea was to take these elements and create something to make people dance. What wound up happening was I then went from 2 turntables to 3 turntables. And that's when I really started flying in acapellas, cutting up 2 tracks back and forth, usually 2 copies of the same record. I'd create echo effects, pre-delay 1 track to scratch in, blend 2 tracks, maybe a percussion track over another one, and then throw an acapella over it to create this kind of live remix. So the 3-deck technique became something that I really kind of immersed myself in. And the guys that were doing it, I know in the UK, Carl Cox was one of them from the techno side. Jeff Mills is another beast.
Oh,
added.
yeah.
There were, and funny enough, and you had guys like Glenn Frisha in New York City, played Hot 97. He used to do 4 decks. At one point in time, he put up 6 turntables and he was kind of bouncing from one to the other. It was really interesting for me to see exactly what his technique was, but it was very technically really on point. But that was kind of more transition. What wound up then happening with me is, as the years and technology progressed from vinyl to CDJs, then I got very into working with Pioneer from a very early point in time in the development of the CD players that became the CDJs. And so I kind of started adding that third CDJ. That became kind of the thing. When it went to the USBs and started adding in really precise looping features, I then started adding a 4th deck, because then I was able to really lock sync everything and really start adding these interesting layers to what I do. Partially because I get bored up there if I'm not doing something that's entertaining. It's like, okay, one record, here comes the other one. I'm not that guy. I always want to also try to make every set as unique as it possibly can be from the other sets that I'm playing. So at the very least, you don't hear my set every time and go, I know exactly what he's going to play, and I've heard him do the same thing. So you can catch me over the space of a weekend. And even if I play some of the same records, the arrangement will be different. There'll be different elements layering over it. And I also like to reintroduce maybe some classic tracks, or maybe not, something that might have been well known in one kind of way, and represent it in a completely different format that then makes it sound completely fresh.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, man, because I really, in 2021, I don't see a lot of people. There aren't a lot of technicians, if you know what I mean, left out there as far as the DJ side goes, which is interesting to me, because I think, you started from vinyl, right? And
That's right.
from turntables that weren't even as advanced as the turntables we have now. And it's interesting to me. Have you ever thought about why now for today? I mean, the technology makes it easy for somebody to start DJing, right? But
Right.
I also feel like, and I hope this is not me being an old man on a porch here, but
gray hairs, the gray hairs,
exactly. But I go to and play at festivals, and I see a lot of younger producers and a lot of younger DJs kind of just doing the bare minimum with the equipment in front of them, and I've always kind of wondered. There's incredible young DJs and producers out there, but there doesn't seem to be a culture of really pushing the live angle forward with DJing. And I'm not sure why that is.
I have a theory, and I really think that it comes down to this. When I started DJing, it wasn't glamorous, and it was very much train spottery, nerdy thing to do. As a matter of fact, there are very few. The only thing I think nerdy would have been building like train models and, Godzilla models. And I used to do that too. So I am a certified nerd.
Nice.
So I come from a very nerdy place where I like to know the soup to nuts and bolts of whatever it is I'm doing. So I get into the cracks and crevices. And at that point in time, that's what DJing was. It's kind of like hip hop. Like, what's interesting now is, just to give you a parallel, you could say the same thing about rap music with lyrics. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's starting to be a bit of a renaissance of the lyrical MC. When you look at stuff like what Jadakiss has done on, on the I forget what the name of the show was, the battle that he did with
the
Dipset.
verses. Yeah.
So, but what's interesting about that is that parallels with DJing in the sense of, when I started out, at that point in time, technicality was a hallmark of a great DJ, but the DJ field itself wasn't that glamorous yet. From the time I started to the time when I really was able to become very successful, the position of the DJ graduated from being the guy in the back room to being the guy in the front room. DJs became producers. So what was interesting is I started off being a DJ who became a producer. And what happened was the visibility of the DJ then became the performance of the artist. So rather than seeing a singer or a band on stage, when a lot of these DJs became producers and had hit records, now you could go see your favorite artist perform as a DJ. What happens? That glamorized DJing.
Right.
And in the interim, you had a lot of people that loved the music that were producers that now saw, well, I'm not going to get on stage with a band or whatever have you. I can DJ. Let me make a hit record, or they're fortunate enough to have a hit record or create a bunch of tracks that then basically establish their musical style. So now their performance and the way to monetize that, aside from being the sales of the records and publishing, was to go up on stage and DJ. And a lot of them didn't know how.
Oh, sure.
So the actual performance aspect of it then kind of became a little bit more of the standing on top of the DJ booth with a microphone and kind of hyping up the crowd, which is what you used to kind of have a hype man to do.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's it makes me think about drum and bass MCs in the UK and all that.
Exactly.
There was a culture.
And see, not to knock anybody who does that, but here's the one thing I realized during that time: the actual person jumping up on stage with the microphone, or jumping up on the decks, it then became about what their hit record was, when they would play it, and whatever the biggest record was, because the DJ sets then shortened up from being an entire night to 4 hours to 3 hours to like 72-minute slots.
Right.
You know what I mean? And what happened was the need to become recognized as a great DJ by being technically good as much as connecting with the audience really decreased. It's kind of like hip hop, where actually having real lyrics and being able to spit bars kind of took a second seat to saying Percocet, Molly, and whatever it is that, would sell a track. So it's kind of a similar parallel between hip hop and DJ.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, man. And it's, at least on my end, I think there's pluses and minuses to both sides of it, right? Because I think part of it, if you talk about the technical side, the underground side getting lost, one reason for that is because it got more popular, right? And the stages got bigger and the DJs got moved further away from the crowds. And all of a sudden, sometimes you can't even tell necessarily if someone is being technical up there or not.
Even if they're the ones who are actually playing the music, if they're actually mixing at all. I've seen a couple of one-fader DJs in my life, trust me.
I've seen a few
of those. Not naming any names.
I've seen a few of those.
I've seen them.
Yep.
I'm sure you have too.
Oh, 100%, man. But for you, it's interesting, talking about coming into it as a DJ first, long before you were a producer. And, now in 2021, I think it's flipped for a lot of people. Like we were saying, people are producers first, then they figure out how to DJ later. What did producing and starting to make your own music look like for you back in the day?
In the beginning, it was more about creating things that nobody had that I could play out. Exclusive beats that nobody had, I'd play in my set, and some people would be like, hey, what's that track? And I would be playing it off of a reel-to-reel, or I'd press up an acetate. Because at that point in time, also, the acetates and reel-to-reels, playing those exclusive tracks that nobody else had, also helped you stand out as a DJ. So that's where it started. What for me is kind of like the kind of one-upmanship of like, I've got my own thing and nobody has it but me and maybe a couple of friends of mine that I've given it to. And then that turned into me releasing my first track, which came out on an imprint that I did, called Ego Trip Records, as the act Ego Trip, which was done by Quark Records. And then shortly after that, I started working with Gladys Pizarro and Strictly Rhythm, where I did my first track, Love Dancing. Love Dancing became a big record, and I give a lot of thanks to Tony Humphries because he had his anniversary at Zanzibar, which is a massive club in New Jersey and very big in the New York City house music scene. And when that record was out on test pressing, he played it, I think, 6 times in that night that he got the record. And by the time the end of the night, Everybody was going, what the hell is that record? Who the hell did that? And that kind of started the people hitting me up to do remixes and me doing records for labels like Nervous Records, Down the Road Ultra Records. I did the first records for both Ultra and Nervous. Funny enough, my tracks were their very first records ever
that's
released.
Incredible.
Under different monikers. But that really started my road of doing a lot of productions. And at that point in time, Love Dancing then became a big record, and I was doing tons of releases on Strictly Rhythm. And then it just kind of developed from there. The remixes that I did started getting bigger and bigger with a lot more artists. And there was a point in time when I was literally in the studio about 5 days a week, every week, for a space of I think 2 to 3 years. And then I would just take this one at first. And then I at first started going on some tours there. So I would either come to the UK and then remix records while I was here on tour, or, take a break between my remixing schedule. So it was pretty intense for quite a while there.
Did you find once you got into production, was it scratching the same itch as DJing? Was it another one of those nerd things you could kind of dive into?
Yes, and it was more of a composite thing. DJing gave me the testing ground for the things that I was coming up with in the studio and the remixes. So I would also then take my experiences from DJing and seeing the reaction to the tracks that I would play and the elements that would work the best, and then add them into my productions.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you say that the reason you started to get into it was to have, exclusives and things people didn't have, which is, I think, as long as we're drawing these parallels between now and then, that was another thing that was different, right? Music was scarce back then.
Yeah.
And having something someone else didn't have was not only easily possible, but that gave you a big advantage as a DJ.
The other thing is that because the access to music wasn't as quick as it is now, because everything is online almost as soon as you put it out. Back then, you had to go to a record shop. You had to, hunt for the record shop that actually had those rare kind of tracks. And then you really had to do your curation based on, you had your record shops that you would go to who would know you, and they would pull aside certain tracks that knew you were in your style. And then you had to go dive a little deeper and do a little bit more digging. So I think that the record research part of it was really another job within the job. I think it's less so now when you look at a lot of DJs that will play whatever the biggest hits are, and listen, and I don't take anything away from them because everybody has their own way of performing. But I do find that if a DJ is kind of just going to the readily available top 10s that they know are going to be the ones that work everywhere, you kind of leave a lot on the table where it comes to not only educating a crowd, but creating a unique experience and also making your own name or your own atmosphere for how you play. And that tends to be a more long-term effect.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point as well. And was it Love Dancing for you? We talked a little earlier. Is that when you first started, playing outside of New York a fair amount as well?
Once Love Dancing was out, that really started my broader appeal. Once I started going to the UK and then starting to play also across the states in San Francisco, LA, then started playing South America, started playing across Europe. Italy became a very big, what I call kind of like my second biggest market was Italy. They really also embraced the very kind of American house sound. And definitely Love Dancing was the first track that really propelled me in that direction.
And is that when you started doing a fair amount of remixes as well? Because that's it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think my understanding is that, you were known as a remixer before you were known, more as Roger Sanchez, the original artist.
What was interesting was when I produced Love Dancing, I did it under the name Roger S.
Okay.
So it's funny because a lot of the old school guys in New York still call me Roger S. Then came my little S-Man moniker, which actually was given to me. I was a Billboard reporting DJ at that time, by the way. So one of the promoters used to call me Roger S, the S-Man. And I'm like, I'm going to take that name. That became kind of one of my alter egos. I was doing a lot of productions under different monikers for different types of sounds. And when Love Dancing became big, even though that was an original production, my remixing started took off almost immediately after that. So for quite a long time, I was so busy doing remixes for other people that I had limited releases that I was able to do, even though I still did quite a few releases during that period of time. But a lot of the remixes that I did performed very, very well. I won a Grammy for the remix that I did of Hella Good for No Doubt.
Right.
Which I was very fortunate with that. But I also had big records like Incognito's Giving It Up, Judy Cheeks. There were a lot of my remixes then became the main version of some of these records
that's interesting
that I had remixed.
too, yeah. Just the list of people you have remixed is sort of ridiculous at this point. I wanted to just quickly, as long as we're talking about it, let me throw a couple names of remixes you've done at you just to see if any of them spark any memories or anything. First of all, I would be remiss if we didn't mention that you have remixed Daft Punk. And if you have any particular memories of that remix.
Well, the interesting one about that one is I met Tomas from Daft Punk right before they signed their deal with Virgin. And I was introduced to him by my friend Kevin McKay, I believe it was, at Soma Records. And he said, you have to meet these kids out of Paris called Daft Punk. He sent me their cassette. Exactly. Back then it was cassettes.
Right.
And on the cassette was Defunk. And I forget what else was on the cassette, but I was like, wow, I like what these kids did. And at that point in time, I was with my girlfriend and I was playing in Paris. I reached out to Tomas, who then we wound up having dinner at the Eiffel Tower because I wanted to go to the Eiffel Tower.
Sure.
So did my ex at that point in time. And he met up with me and he was this young kid who was like, I never ever come to these places. It's a little bit strange for me, but I wanted to meet you. Fast forward a year and a half later, they've exploded. They asked me, DJ Sneak, Junior Sanchez, a bunch of other people to go on tour with them. And I started the remix of Revolution 909 on the tour bus with Tomas and Guiman. And then I completed it with Junior Sanchez. So that's how I wound up remixing Daft Punk.
That's incredible. What was that?
Being on their homework tour was insane.
I was about to say, what was that? I mean, yeah, I'm glad we stumbled into that because that must have just been ridiculous.
It was the very first really rock and roll on a tour bus tour I'd ever been on. And it's a testament to the fact that basically every penny they got for their tour, they put it into creating that tour. So they paid everybody, and a weird one, kind of like one of the most pervasive memories I had was sleeping in the tour bus, and on my tour bus, one of the sound guys had the smelliest socks in the face of the universe. He dropped it behind one of his benches, and we couldn't on one of the bunks. We couldn't find where the hell that smelly sock was for like a week. But aside from that, it was definitely amazing to see these kids, because they were kids, building an entire studio and production on stage and how they were performing their productions live with behind masks and so on and so forth. It was really amazing to see them do that.
Were they already getting to the point of really trying to, be anonymous and not show their faces and all that? Yeah,
they were on the we want to wear masks from kind of almost the very, very beginning of that tour.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of, you could make arguments for other people, but I was talking to Busy P about this a while back, and I was saying, I mean, they were kind of we look at DJs as rock stars as fairly normal now, but they were one of the first that I think really changed that perception.
Well, it's funny because Pedro, was their tour manager, and I got to know Pedro really, really well during
he's
that
a great
tour.
Guy, yeah.
And it's how they were consummate nerds. You have to understand this. Guimas and Tomas and Guiman are consummate nerds, which is what makes them so powerful in terms of how they create, and their vision of how they do things is very precise, and they won't do anything that they don't want to do.
Right.
And that is something that I totally, totally respect for them all to the utmost. Whether it means it costs them a fortune or they make a fortune, it doesn't matter to them. They're like, we have a vision, we're going to do it. And I'm like, 100%.
Yeah.
And I think that is what makes them rock stars.
Yeah, that's such a great way to put it. Even walking away, right? Even walking away from the project, that's, defining success on their own.
That's about as gangster as you get.
Oh man, yeah, absolutely.
That's straight gangster.
Yeah.
It's like, we're big, we're about as big as we can get, right? Call it quits.
Yeah, we're done. Yeah, absolutely. Done. Yeah.
Done.
Yeah, just done, man. Well, speaking of other absolutely huge stars, am I correct that you remixed both Michael and Janet Jackson separately?
I did. I did 3 tracks from Michael. Let me say, I did Dangerous. I did Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. And I did one other one. I think it was. I did one other one. Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. There's one other Michael Jackson one that I did. I'm pretty sure I did like 3 of them. Definitely 2 of them. One of which never came out.
Okay,
as far as I'm aware, because at that point in time, that's when that whole scandal hit.
Of course.
So
yeah.
I think that was right. I think there was Dangerous, and there was one other one that was just about to come out, and then the scandal hit, and then they pulled it. They pulled everything.
Did you ever did you ever talk to him or get any kind of feedback? It's interesting. Like, I never really thought about the idea of like, how aware was Michael Jackson of house music? You know what I mean?
He was aware, from my understanding. He, heard every remix. He personally approved them, as far as I know. I didn't speak to him. I met Janet Jackson because I actually performed in the UK. I DJ'd and opened one of her concerts.
Oh, wow.
Very kind of like right around the time I had done the remix for Best Things in Life for Free. So I performed at a Janet Jackson concert as kind of one of the opening DJs.
How was that?
It was kind of surreal for me at that point in time, because the crowd that was there was a very young crowd that probably didn't really understand very much about what I was playing, but they, obviously had heard the remix. So it was kind of cool, just kind of playing for them. It was really more of a warm up for the live show.
Right.
But it was very cool. I briefly met Janet kind of in the back. They introduced me to her, and she said, "I really like your remix." And
that's great.
About as far as I got from her. That was great.
Yeah, no, it's incredible, man. Do you approach, as a producer on the nerdy tip, do you approach a remix differently production wise than you would your own original tracks?
Yeah, because when I do a remix, I try to respect the original artist's intention and marry my own interpretation of what their intention is to it. But I always try to preserve something that's unique and endemic to the artist in my own remix and production. So even though I may take it far away, there's always going to be a grain of that in there, because I would want someone to give me that equal respect when they remix my track.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Well, what does it look like for you in the studio these days? If you're just sitting down in the studio to write a song, do you have like a standard flow? Do you have a process? Does it change over time?
I try to almost approach each track uniquely, but inevitably they always wind up having some sort of common thread. There are some tracks where I'll start with a lyric or a vocal or a melody. Some tracks I'll just start with beats. I've done some tracks on my laptop and my control, and on the road. Then other things I'll start off in the studio. I've recently, I got an Ableton push.
Oh, sure.
Just
yeah.
to kind of try to work a little bit differently. I used to program on the SP1200. I'm actually refurbishing it to start sampling and approaching things the way I used to, just because the technology leads me to certain certain results. So I tried to change it to get different results, and also to force myself to think differently so that not every single track will sound like it's produced in an assembly line. I really try to make each track be its own unique expression.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, man. I think that's such a good tip for any producers out there watching or listening, because especially that's how you sustain a long career, right? That's how you can avoid getting pigeonholed, I would imagine.
I think you have to challenge yourself.
Yeah.
You have to challenge yourself. Was the instant I start feeling very comfortable and feeling like I know what I'm doing, I'm like, it's time to do something else that makes me feel very uncomfortable, and maybe I don't know what I'm doing. And then that's the thrill of discovering how to make it sound like something that I know what I'm doing.
Absolutely. Well, maybe that's a good way to talk about, back in 2000, 2001, you put out the First Contact album, and you put out the song Another Chance, which, becomes this giant hit, kind of on a different level than your previous productions, right? Was there, I'd love to hear any of your impressions, your memories of that time of having that kind of massive international hit. But I'm also curious about after that, in this context of what we were just talking about, keeping it fresh, reinventing yourself. Was there pressure to sort of follow that up that you felt or that other people were telling you?
During the time when I made Another Chance, it was literally the last track on the album that I was making, and I was signed to Sony. The A&Rs and the division that signed me kind of was collapsed. So Simon Dunmore came in with his newly formed label Defected and said, you know what, I want to take over this project. We'd been friends for years, and he said, I want to help you A&R it and develop it. And so he kind of guided me through the halfway stage to the completion of the album. And then he was the one who kind of said, as I previously had a couple of singles out before the album was finished. And then he was like, Another Chance, I think, let's go with that one. And when that took off, it caught me by surprise, because that was, my concept was, I want to do another underground track for the album. Hence Another Chance,
right?
Which is pretty much everything that's not the underground for the album. And then the kind of media circus that I had to then jump into was something brand new for me. And when I say that, I mean in circus in the sense of getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, going to the 7 a.m. TV shows, morning wake up shows, never mind the Buzzcocks, the ITV News, and just a bunch of different, because they went number one in the UK.
Yeah, getting
first.
Treated like a pop star a little bit, right?
Like a pop star. And it was something that I was really kind of like, it's just me, the DJ here. It's like, you guys, you sure you know it? All right, cool. And then after that, at the same time that was happening, I started also making sure I was dropping very underground tracks. I always wanted to maintain that kind of underground credibility, and more importantly, the ability to express myself and not just things that I know is going to be more commercially successful and viable. I both felt and ignored the feeling of needing to follow this up. I deliberately went and did some very underground stuff, because I'm like, that may be me being able to connect with everyone, but I have my core, which is I'm always going to embrace. I also, as a DJ, what's different from being a traditional kind of pop star singer, whatever have you, my career trajectory was predominantly clubs, festivals, so on and so forth. I kind of don't need to chase that. And a lot of people, I feel, follow and fall into that. I have to chase this pop stardom, especially when there's a big machine after them. I was able to kind of maintain through doing remixes and keeping that level of visibility within records that have, the crossover potential, without allowing myself to fall into I have to have another record as big as Another Chance or I'm a failure. And I kind of went the other way with that. So that's kind of really helped me.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think that makes me think about what we were saying about Daft Punk a minute ago, right? Is kind of not always choosing the money option, not always choosing the fame option, and trying to stay a little more true to the roots of it. I think that's a really good lesson, man. And I think it's obviously worked out. It's brought us to this point. And 20 years later, Another Chance is kind of having this renaissance itself, right? There's a reissue of it now and a new remix from Oliver Heldens.
Yes. And for me, the fact that I've been playing it out these last 20 years, and I try to play it out less and less over a period of time, just because I was like, okay, I have other records.
Right, yeah.
And I have had other records that have done very, very well, thankfully. But more importantly is I almost forgot how emotionally connective that song was. And I started in the past few years making sure that I played it out. With the reissue, I've seen it connect to an entirely new generation, because a lot of the younger kids that are coming out are experiencing it for the first time. And an older generation that was experiencing it the first time relive it. And it's just this interesting juxtaposition of these two worlds, and getting Oliver Heldens to remix it. I love what he did with it, because I didn't want somebody that was going to take it in a very similar place that I already kind of occupy. He has a much more progressive approach to it that has a different type of audience, but he's also maintained the core of the original expression that I've done, which is the emotional quotient of the track. So for that, amongst other things, I really applaud him for how he's handled the remix, but he's also come at it with love, which is just the other thing. Anybody that I've had a lot of people approach me over the years, a couple of people have done cover versions of it, and everyone has approached it with love, which is something that I really appreciate, how much that track has connected with people and how much it means to some people independent of me. So right. It's kind of its own thing now.
Yeah,
it's like I don't look at it as like my record. I look at it as the record I did, but it's kind of like a kid. They grow up and they're their own human.
Yeah, they went off to school, right? They're in college now. Yeah,
they're adults now. They've got beards if they're your son, or they're fully grown. It's like you can only claim the fact that you brought them into this world, but they're their own humans. They're their own people. So this is kind of like what songs become.
That's so interesting. I mean, yeah, do you think at this point in your career, do you think about the idea of legacy? Is legacy an important idea to you?
I think legacy as a retrospect of the moments that I've been able to have creating, and not only, getting records that I put out and playing these big events or small events, whatever have you. But for me, it's more about what my connection was with each of these tracks that I've done to different people. I don't think I consciously set out to have a legacy, but I think subconsciously my road has kind of always led me to this place. And I'm very blessed and grateful to have these moments in my life and with these tracks that have had that impact on people. So I consider myself one of the fortunate few in this world that have been able to follow the path that they really love and wanted to follow, and have it work out. Sure. That doesn't happen for everyone.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, man. That's the place to be in, is the place of gratitude. I talk about that all the time on this podcast. Whether you're currently succeeding or struggling, you still have to look for that gratitude. And I think that's the only way you can kind of make it through a long career doing what we do. And
I think the thing people, if I want to leave people with anything in terms of it, is that there have been many difficult moments and periods of time in my career and in my life. And alongside of the very wonderful moments, I don't want to change any of them, because they have created the path that I'm on and formed the person I am. It's the perspective that I've learned, and it's taken me time to get there, but I've learned to look back at all these moments. Okay, what would I do different now? But what did I learn from that? And now I'm grateful that happened. How does that help me better this world and better myself. And I think that's kind of the combination of the two that allows me to kind of just keep going forward and doing new things.
Yeah, I mean, that was, as we're, starting to wrap up a bit here, that was going to be my next question, was what keeps you here after all this time? What part of what you do is still exciting and fun? What do you look forward to now in your career?
I think all of it, equally as much as I'm having as much fun playing out now as I did when I first started playing, with the same level of respect. I've been always respectful of my career and of what I've been given, because I know a lot of people don't get this. So I enjoy all of it. And each and every performance that I do and each and every production that I do is something new. It's unexplored and uncharted territory. Even if I've done it before, it's just kind of doing it again this way in this moment. It's its own unique thing. So I appreciate each and every moment that I get, and I thoroughly enjoy it. And I make sure to remind myself on a daily basis that not everyone is as fortunate as I am. So I better damn well be appreciative and give it 100,000%, and don't ever take it for granted.
I love that. I mean, that's I think another way to say it, or when you were saying it, what I heard too, is you figured out a way to be in the moment for all of these moments that you're having, which I think for people in this line of work, man, not everyone is able to do that. It comes at you really fast. And so I think if you've figured out a way to do that, that's a huge key.
It does come with a bit of age and experience, because there have been many times when I've always been looking, okay, especially when I've been on the hamster wheel, what's the next tour? And I've always been like, okay, I'm living in the next tour while I'm doing this one. And then I kind of learned to step back and go, hang on a minute, plan for the next one, but take a moment to appreciate where you're at right now. So that definitely does come with time and a bit of experience.
We had a couple questions from the people watching, the people in the chat right now. I'd love to just throw a couple of these at you very quickly. Yeah. Let's see. So Sean is asking, shout out to Sean. You've had various personas over the years. Which is your favorite one? And also asking about how you've manifested your architectural roots into your music, which we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier.
It's funny because of all the monikers that I have, I think the S-Man tends to be one of my favorite ones, just because I never know what he's going to do next. He could go straight up techno. He could go very bassy. He can go ambient. The S-Man doesn't answer to anyone but himself. And he just kind of like, and I talk about him in the third person because that's kind of how I feel. Like when the S-Man takes over, it's like, okay, Roger Sanchez, get out the way.
Sometimes you're in the studio and you're making something and you're like, who's making this right now? Yeah.
It's like the S-Man goes, get out the way. I've got some work to do. It's time for me to get serious. So he's kind of like my favorite alter ego. And I think just having roots with everything, having a foundation for everything is where architecture really manifests in my musical approach, having beats, bass, and making sure when I'm playing as much as when I'm composing, I have those things that are the foundation on which I build.
Next question, no name left, but it's a good question. Do you remember what the first record you bought was?
I believe it was Let No Man Put Us Under. My first choice was the actual first record I bought.
Man, I need to go. I know I've heard that record, but I'm going to have to, when we're done here, go back and listen.
No man put us under.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. Nice.
Everybody's jacked that bass line.
Yeah, that's great, man. All right, next question. Sean is asking, what was your production setup like in the early days?
I used to have, my very first computer was an Atari 1040 ST, and I used to work with SimtiTrax Gold, along with an SP 1200 and a Yamaha drum machine. And then I moved over to Mac, and then I briefly worked with Digital Performer, but then once Logic came along, I was kind of all in with Logic, SP 1200, S950, and then an S1000 Akai sampler, and then an emulator 3500. I think was it the E3000 or the E3500? It was the emulator Samper, big blue.
Yeah, that's some good gear, man.
Yeah,
those
are my
how do you
and
know
then
how to use them?
And a Juno 106.
Oh, a Juno 106, nice. How did you know how to use them? Was anyone showing you how to do this at the time?
I mean, in the beginning, I kind of I had an engineer who kind of showed me how when he was working on Simpty tracks, and I just kind of copied that. And then I was kind of reading some of the manuals from friends of mine gave me, and I had a couple of friends of mine who were like, okay, I think it was Kenny Dope had an SP12 at that point in time, and he got an SP1200, and I was like, I need to rock with that.
Yeah.
I started rocking with the SP1200 at that point in time.
Man, it's so interesting how that's changed. And that kind of goes into, we just got one more question from Jordan in upstate New York. And it kind of goes into this question. Jordan's asking about how do you see crypto affecting your career moving forward, if at all? But I kind of want to take that question and expand it a little bit to just talk about technological innovation over time, because I think you've always been, my understanding is you've always been on new technology and adopting new technology quickly. 100%. And I'd love to hear you talk about how technology has affected your career and how you've adapted with it over the years.
Well, what I've been able to do is really take a look at what new technologies have to offer. And then sometimes I try to hack it myself and see what I can either don't read the manual and dive in, or read the manual and find what else it can do. I've been working with Pioneer for many years in terms of developments of various iterations of the CDJs and the mixers. So I'm very much into sound, and I've got that audiophile aspect of it. It's interesting now because I'm very much into the whole NFT world, cryptocurrencies, where blockchain is going in terms of how it affects artists and pretty much any type of transactions that you're going to see in the future. It's definitely I've got several. I kind of during the lockdown, I got back into my graffiti art, which was also a very big part of my kind of upbringing. And I've dropped a few NFTs on various platforms. But what I really see is the long-term effect that blockchain is going to have for finding new ways to connect the fan to the creative, and then creating unique experiences that can be tokenized. You have social tokens that are going to be developed for different brands of and an artist themselves is a brand,
right.
Be it Disney or be it Defected or whatever have you, and people within that community that can directly support the artist by buying these digital tokens and digital assets. There's going to come a point where I'm going to create some music and some kind of audiovisual assets that are only going to be able to be purchased within the ecosystem of whatever it is that I'm doing within the token or the NFT world. So I really see that creating more defined connections between artists and fans and consumers in the future. And that also connecting to live world. So you can go in the future, do you want to come see me at a club? There'll be an NFT as your ticket, as your hard ticket, but then that NFT can also have a unique track that's only available on an NFT. It's limited edition. You can then resell it down the road, or you can keep it and it can accrue value. There's things that you could take away. So there's a very interactive aspect to this.
Sure, yeah.
This is where I see the future going with this.
Are you familiar with Audius, the platform Audius?
Somebody's mentioning Audius to me recently, and there's a couple of other platforms I think that are also starting to really take root in this space.
Yeah. I was just I asked because just last week on the podcast, I was talking to one of the higher ups at Audius about the platform, and it's built on the blockchain as well. And really, they have a very philosophical bent about it, kind of like what you were talking about, of really trying to even the playing field and to open it up for everybody and to sort of break down the old paradigms of it. And yeah, man, it'd be really, really interesting to see where it goes. I'm also curious for you, like you were even back on vinyl and then everything went digital, right? And I have to imagine there were probably a lot of your peers who resisted that transition. or people who are angry about it.
I mean, the interesting thing is that everybody has merits in terms of what they like. So if you love vinyl, you love the sound of vinyl, you love the feel of vinyl, it leads you down a certain path. I'm never going to be like, oh no, abandon vinyl. But what I will say is, I don't think you necessarily should shut out other technologies. And I think that every single one of the technologies has their own merit, and how you harness that and move forward is what's going to allow you to become successful or to have longevity or not.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And just again, on the nerd tip before we go, you were also early to podcasts, right? Which I have to, as someone with a podcast, I got to give you props for that.
Thank you. I really got on the podcasting side of things because I had started doing a radio show. I think I'm on my 1039th show coming up for Release Yourself. And it started from me taking over Pete Tong's show and kind of sitting in for him as a host. That then led me to creating my show Release Yourself, which then led me to creating the podcast very early on to reach a broader audience with my show. So I've always been about, how do I connect with people? Technology for me is just a medium to reach more people. So however I can do it and harness it, I'm going to definitely look at it and try.
And you've been interviewing people more recently as well yourself, right?
I've been sitting in where you're sitting.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I have a podcast called The Hustle, and the idea is interviewing different people, starting off in the dance music industry, and then branching off into other industries, just kind of how they got to where they got to and what their hustle looked like to get them to their place. That's kind of like, okay, I can tell you what my hustle was like, but what was your hustle like? How did you get to where you are?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I love it for that same reason, man. I love hearing other people's stories, and it gives me creative inspiration to hear it, For anyone listening, you got to check out the Hustle podcast. He's talked to Fatboy Slim, Claude Von Stroke, a bunch of amazing, amazing people. This has been fantastic, man. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Before we go, is there anything else we didn't talk about? Anything else you want to let people know? Anything else that's on your mind?
Well, as I mentioned before, definitely check me out on Twitch. Catching a lot of not only my live shows where I'll be performing from the booth, but some very unique live streams and some stuff that I'm going to be coming up in, probably in some studio sessions. And getting ready for new music, man. And thanks to everyone who supported Another Chance all these years. Definitely check out Oliver Heldens' version. It's killer.
Yeah,
and lots more to come.
Hell yeah, man. Well, I'm going to ask you the final question, which is the same question I ask at the end of each one of these interviews. It's just a very quick thing, kind of the first thing that pops into your head kind of question. Just looking for a time in your life, a memory, a moment, could be from any time, when in a single moment, music really deeply affected you, really had a deep impact on you in that moment. And that's meant to be a really broad question. There's no wrong answer.
This is a bit of a bittersweet one, because it's a very personal one to me. But I had a very close friend of mine who was a manager of mine named Mart Andrups. And he passed away fairly young. And when he passed away, at the point that I was informed of his passing, had happened to be listening to Everything But the Girl, missing the Todd Terry remix.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And just that connection just cemented that moment. Whereas I terribly missed this person because he was genuinely my best friend at that moment in time, but I was genuinely appreciative of everything I had experienced with that person. And in a way, it's kind of like the subtext to where Another Chance emotionally comes from. It's celebrating that moment, which is, I have a feeling why Another Chance is also a bittersweet track, because that moment became ingrained in my mind. So it's a very powerful illustration of how music could cement the moment in time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then when you listen back to it later, you get, almost the echo of that memory, but then you also know that moment will never happen again.
Exactly.
Yeah, man, it's And I think there's something in what you're saying, man. It's beautiful. And I think, at least for me, and I think for a lot of other people, that's why we're still here doing it, right? It's, you're
100%.
You're trying to chase those moments and create those feelings, but also in the hopes that we're going to have lots more of those moments, right?
I'm looking forward to the next moment.
Absolutely. Well, Roger, I really appreciate the time. I know I kept you a little long, but I really enjoyed this, man. Thank you for doing this.
Same here. Pleasure.
Good, man. I'm glad. And much love to you, man. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And anytime you want to come back and do this, man, I'm happy to have you back on.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, man. Thank you so much. Peace.
Cheers.